Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aero Space and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 3rd to 9th of May 2021. And what a week. Before getting started, I'd like to send a special shout out to our good friends at GoTaikonauts and SpaceWatch.global, two excellent sources of space industry news. This week, we bring you a plethora of launch-related updates, including a funding round from CAS Space, some announcements from Onespace, a rocket engine test from JZYJ. But first, Jean will bring us an update on the event that has been captivating the entire world over the last couple of weeks. That is the unplanned, or uncontrolled, I should say, re-entry of the Long March 5B.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
Jean, the Long March 5B. Everyone has been talking about this on Twitter and on the broader media. So what's your take on the Long March 5B situation?
Yes, definitely. I think that was the event of the week. So let me just rewind and tell the story from the beginning. So 10 days or so ago, we saw China launch Long March 5B with on board the core module of the Chinese space station, the Tianhe module. And we did a deep dive into that in last week's episode. So our listeners can check that out if they're interested in that. And so just back to the rocket, the Long March 5B, as mentioned also last week, this is really a beast of rocket. It's over 800 tons at liftoff. It's able to put 23 tons into low Earth orbit. It's really comparable to a lot of the largest operational rockets currently in service at the moment. And so the way it's structured is you have 4 strap-on boosters, which burn liquid kerosene and oxygen. And you also have this huge core stage, which burns liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And on top of that core stage, you have basically the payload bay, and that's where you had the Tianhe core module. And so this rocket, the Long March 5B, last week, it took the Tianhe module into space. And since there was no upper stage, it was this core stage that actually took the module into low Earth orbit. And what happened is that this leaves the core stage then stranded into, in low Earth orbit. And since it's rather low altitude in low Earth orbit, there's still some atmosphere. And that means that this core stage is going to enter, multiple decaying orbits, and at some point it just re-enters into the atmosphere and disintegrates, and potentially also could hit the ground or the ocean. And so atmospheric entry is actually a really common thing that you see in the space industry. But what is less common maybe is to have such a big piece of space hardware re-enter. And so here I think this core stage was, even though it was, it was empty, didn't have much fuel left inside, it was still at least several dozens of tons. And so that's definitely very big. And the usual good practice is that, is to perform a controlled re-entry. So it's to do some maneuvers to maximize the chance of the re-entry to take place over the ocean, so you don't have any people or any property that's harmed. But this rule historically hasn't always been followed. And by the way, it's not even a rule, as mentioned. It's there's no regulation. It's more of a good practice. And so that's what happened for Long March 5B. There was no control during the reentry. The Long March 5B is just not designed for that, as far as I know. And so, yeah, so it just entered the atmosphere without any control. The chances actually of it hitting someone, or some property or some house are actually quite slim, because the Earth is covered to a very large extent by water. I think it's up to 70 or 71%. And even if it hits land, there's always a very strong percentage that it hits an area with low population density. But again, the chance is non-zero, so definitely we should be looking forward to more controlled reentries in the future and not uncontrolled reentries. But just spoilers here. So this reentry took place a couple hours ago. This was this morning, and things went well. The re-entered over the Indian Ocean, and so the Long March 5B core stage didn't generate any damage. And so what was more interesting perhaps about this event is that it wasn't really the event in itself, but more the reactions that there were to this event. So there was a lot of discussion in Western media on this event, but on the other hand, on the Chinese side, it was literally a non-event. So I personally follow a lot of Chinese WeChat official accounts. I look at Chinese space media, and there was literally no discussion on this Long March 5B reentry. There was some brief statements from CNSA 48 hours before discussing, their predictions in terms of where this core stage would re-enter. There was some discussion on Weibo as well, but nothing, like literally no discussion at all. It wasn't a big thing at all. And on the Western side, on the other hand, you had a lot of media that were playing up this event and with this doomsday approach where some even suggested, wow, Long March 5B could hit New York and things like that. So that was, not unlike sometimes the approach you see when they discuss near-Earth objects and asteroids. And I guess that's maybe due also to deteriorating Sino-US relations. So definitely you have this bias, and this bias is on both sides. As mentioned, I follow a lot of Chinese space news, and when they discuss US space, you also have this bias, and I'll put a few screenshots to show you what I'm talking about. But anyway, I think due to the deteriorating relations between U.S. and China, there's a lot of work to be done to get this sort of bias undone.
Totally agree. Yeah. And it was certainly a fascinating cultural event this morning, Hong Kong time, when I was sitting here watching on the one side of my screen Elon Musk hosting Saturday Night Live, and on the other side of my screen having my Twitter feed with all these updates of, where's the Long March 5B going to land? And to your point, yeah, sometime around, I think 11 a.m. or so Hong Kong time, we found out that there were no Nigerian homes that were destroyed this time by the falling rocket. If I recall, it was Nigeria last time. But digressing, yeah, really just a fascinating cultural event. And I think it's just interesting to see the very wide variety of reactions. So to your point, you had the doomsday articles saying that New York City is going to get leveled by this. You had the articles saying this is a non-event. And then you even had just some space fans on Twitter saying, chill the F out, everyone. This is just a rocket and it's not that big of a deal. And I have to appreciate that. So I guess a couple of things that I would mention. So I think it's probably in the short term, very relatively bad PR for the Chinese space program, in the sense that the Western media has really made this correctly seem that China is being somewhat reckless in designing rockets that do not have controlled reentry. But I do think that long term, this is probably a good thing for the space sector for a couple of reasons. So the first thing I would point out is the last couple of weeks, the last 10 days have gotten a lot more people interested in space, I think. So we've seen a lot of different space personalities that have been interviewed by media around the world over the last couple of weeks. And case in point was about 4 days ago, I was listening to my Babbage Economist weekly tech podcast, and the first person they interviewed was Andrew Jones. And I was thinking, wow, that voice sounds very familiar. And they said, oh, it's Andrew Jones of Space News. And, well, okay. So yeah, I think that this event has brought more kind of general attention to space, and that's probably a good thing. The second point is that it is possible that the negative press coverage will press China to be a little bit more careful with the design of future rockets in terms of having controlled reentry. I think that's speculative, but it's more likely that they will be more careful than that they will be more reckless because of this. And then finally, a little bit speculative as well, but I do think that this event may make people a bit more cognizant of the extent to which space debris and related issues can be a problem, and just the extent to which space is hard, and that we need to be careful. We need to, kind of cross all of our T's and dot all of our I's and make sure that we're not launching, dozens of tons rockets that don't have any controlled reentry and just praying that they don't land on anyone's house. So with that being said, nothing else from my side on the Long March 5B. Jean, do you want to go into the next update about the company that has my favorite name of any Chinese commercial space company?
Absolutely. So that would be JZYJ and Jen that we saw last week. So we saw last week that JZYJ and Jen had conducted a hot fire test of their fully assembled Longyun engine. And so the Longyun engine is an 80-ton thrust gas generator cycle engine. It burns liquid methane and liquid oxygen. and it's one of the two engines that JZYJ has been developing. The other one being the much lighter thrust, the Lingyun engine, which produces 10 tons of thrust, and that is also a Methalox engine. And now there's maybe one technical specification on the JZYJ engines that's worth mentioning, and that is definitely something that JZYJ has been playing on a lot in its marketing material, playing it as a competitive advantage, and that is their ignition system. So they've developed this torch igniter system, which is basically the system that triggers the combustion when you're in the combustion chamber, and this historically has been done with hypergolic fuels, which are components that react spontaneously with each other, and this is what triggers the combustion. Or there's also been historically pyrotechnic charges that trigger the combustion. But this, according to JZYJ, is not great for reusability because, you need one pyrotechnic charge for each time you restart this engine, and this has to take place multiple times for a reusable rocket. So what JZYJ have developed is basically this, a mini combustion chamber, basically, which probably burns liquid methane and liquid oxygen, which is, the fuel and oxidizer of their engine. And this mini combustion chamber is triggered by a spark plug like you'd have in a car. And this then produces a flame that then is used to trigger the combustion in the main combustion engine, where you have the turbopumps injecting the liquid methane and the liquid oxygen. And that is also, I think, the solution that was selected by SpaceX for their Raptor engine, which is also a Methalox engine. So taking a step back now here on the Longyun engine, it is still unclear which rocket companies will be using their engine, because JZYJ is not a rocket manufacturer. They're a rocket engine pure players such as Aerojet Rocketdyne in the US. And so they don't build their own rockets. And 80-ton thrust for the Longyun engine, that's quite a bit of thrust. And so far, since their rocket engine is geared for reusability, we can expect to see this Longyun engine on on a core stage of a rocket with a cluster-like architecture, with 5 or 7 or 9 Longyun engines. And considering that each of these engines produce 80 tons of thrust, that is suggestive of quite a large rocket. And so I don't see what that rocket can be at the moment. There's less suspense regarding their smaller Lingyun engine, which produces 10 tons of thrust. We know that Onespace, for example, will be using the Lingyun engine for their VTVL prototype, the RLVT6. And more recently, we saw that Rocket Group, so that's a Chinese company, Chinese name is Huojianpai. They announced earlier this year that they would use the Lingyun engine from JZYJ to build their rocket, which is called the Darwin-1, which puts about 300 kilograms into low Earth orbit. And they also plan a much larger rocket by 2025. So that rocket could be using the 80-ton thrust Longyun engine, but that remains to be confirmed. That's speculation on my part. So we'll have to wait and see who uses the Longyun engine 80-ton thrust engine in the end.
Kind of a cool name for Rocket Group's rocket, the Darwin-1. I suppose the Beagle-1 would be more appropriate, because if I recall, the Beagle was the ship that Darwin sailed around on. But nonetheless, Darwin-1, not bad. So back to JZYJ. Certainly an interesting development by the company with the least marketable name in Chinese commercial space, JZYJ. And so JZYJ, I would point out that in contrast to companies like Onespace, JZYJ, they've had an impressive level of focus over their relatively short corporate life. So basically, you've had a singular focus on building rocket engines and of developing innovative technologies to put into rocket engines. And again, if we compare this to, say, Onespace or even some of the satellite manufacturers, they've started off doing one thing, like Onespace wanting to build rockets, and then they've started to try to do, building small satellites or building rocket kind of control systems, and really trying to do many different things. It seems like JZYJ really a lot of focus on just developing these engines. And this seems to be paying some dividends in the sense that they've been making pretty steady progress over the past year or so in terms of both technological steps being taken and also fundraising. We've seen a couple of fundraising rounds from them over the last, say, 6 to 9 months. And so, again, seems that this strategy of very focused on one piece of technology is an interesting way to do it. One last point from my side that I would like to bring up is that the Longyun was specifically stated as being compatible with a 3.35 meter diameter rocket in a 5-engine configuration. And I think it's probably not a coincidence that the ZQ-2 of Land Space and the Long March 7 among other CAS rockets. They also have a diameter of 3.35 meters. So again, certainly an interesting example of a company that has picked one highly specific technology and developed the hell out of it over a few year period. And now if they can only find a more marketable and less awkward English name than the admittedly great Scrabble word. Next time I play Scrabble, I'm going to try to pass JZYJ as a Scrabble word. And if anyone says no, that's going to end badly. Okay, so nothing else from my side on JZYJ. And Jean, all good from your side as well?
Yep.
Excellent. So moving on to our third piece of news of the week, and it is yet another commercial launch company related piece of news because, hey, why not have 30 commercial launch companies? So we saw on May 6th, CAS Space, which is the launch company of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, announced a 200 million RMB B plus round of funding. And the announcement also noted that the company has raised around 600 million RMB, so almost 100 million US dollars in the past year or so, from financiers such as the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Yuexiao Capital, which is a kind of Guangzhou government fund, as well as Zhongxin, and then the Hunan Aviation and Aerospace Fund, which is something that I would like to do a bit more digging into because that sounds like a very interesting fund. The article also mentions that CAS Space will have their first launch in half two of 2021 of a solid-fueled rocket, and that the rocket is part of the CAS's 13th five-year plan in space science and technology projects. And the rocket to be launched in the second half of this year will have a payload to SSO of about 1.5 tons. So I guess I would point out a couple of takeaways here. So first, we have a lot of money being put into CAS Space recently. And this is not the only kind of second generation, second tier launch company to be having such a big year. So we've seen Tianhe Aerospace also raise quite a few rounds of funding over the last year. We've certainly talked at length about our good friends at JZYJ. And you have other companies like Rocket Group that are also, starting to raise money. So I think the takeaway is that while you have several pretty well-established Chinese commercial launch companies, there's still quite a lot of investor interest in the sort of second generation of launch companies. It's hard to know with certainty, but it's probably a safe bet to say that a lot of the future demand for constellations is going to be soaked up by like CALT and SAST and X-Space and China Rocket and Landspace and others. And so it kind of makes you wonder to what extent is there going to be a market for all of these relative latecomers. But again, we are still seeing hundreds of millions of RMB thrown at these companies, despite the fact that it's, the 16th commercial launch company to have been established in China. So it will be interesting to see how this all shakes out. But again, a big round of funding for CAS Space. So just last point on my side, and this kind of goes back to an earlier point here. So just this idea that certain companies, notably like JZYJ, they've clearly articulated a unique value proposition. So focusing on engines. Whereas you have a company like Rocket Group, which is just the analogy that I would give is that it's showing up at a bar with a closing time of midnight at 11:50 p.m. and hoping to get sloshed. I mean, it seems like they're really showing up quite late for this party, and they're just hoping that this is all going to work out. And again, I have no reason to believe that Rocket Group is unable to do what they want to do, but it just seems like there are a lot of launch companies in China now, and a lot of them have quite a lot of money. And I would, last point here would be that with CAS Space in particular, I think they may have a somewhat better case to make than a lot of the other second generation launch companies, in the sense that CAS Space has some degree of sort of internal demand, with the Chinese Academy of Sciences doing quite a lot of things in space. And so you could imagine, in the future, if CAS Space is indeed, manufacturing 30 rockets per year, which is what they say they would like to do, you could imagine a lot of the Chinese Academy of Sciences requirements for launch being met by CAS Space. So, Jean, anything else on your side from CAS Space?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, and I think you touched a very interesting topic of this very crowded commercial launch landscape that we have in China. And speaking of that, we have another piece of news this week that's related. We heard over the past week in the Chinese media that the launch company Onespace was close to raising a new round of funding. And so this seems to confirm the comeback of the company Onespace, which was rumored to be, to a very large extent, in dire straits back in 2018 when it failed its first orbital attempt with the launch of the OSM rocket. And so as we reported in Dongfang Hour episode, something in early February, Onespace has successfully, since then, raised a round of funding in September 2020, and then they successfully launched an OSX rocket, a suborbital rocket, that earlier in February this year. And so the fact that apparently, currently, or in the coming weeks, they're able to raise another round of funding just a mere 7 to 8 months after their previous round, which was, as mentioned, in September 2020. This shows that there's definitely a renewed attractiveness to the company. And so in this media report about this new round of funding, or future round of funding, because it hasn't been confirmed just yet, there are two things that were interesting. The first one is, the objective of this round of funding. Apparently, this new round of funding will be used to fund the construction of the industrial bases that Onespace plans in 3 areas: Beijing, Chongqing, and Xi'an. And secondly, it's that this round of funding will also be used to develop the Linglong series of rockets. And so there's apparently the Linglong 1 solid fueled rockets, and there's the Linglong 2 liquid fueled rockets. And for those who have been following Chinese space for a while, and you know the background of Onespace, this definitely comes as a surprise, because Onespace was known to be essentially, a manufacturer of solid fueled rockets. That's the only thing they went for. And they were actually probably the only, or literally the only, Chinese commercial launch companies to go for that strategy. All the other ones, the land spaces, the iSpaces, Galactic Energy, CAS Space, all the other ones, basically, they all went for this mix of solid and liquid. And apparently this is going to be the new strategy of Onespace. So so you have the Linglong 1 family of rockets. There's the 1A, which is just a core stage. You have the 1B, which is a core stage and 2 strap-on boosters. And you have the 1C, which is with 4 strap-on boosters. So this would compose their solid fueled rocket family. It's probably just a rebadging of their previous solid fueled rockets that were called OSM, M2, and M4. It was the same idea with adding strap-on boosters, and all of this being based on their 25-ton and 60-ton thrust solid fueled rocket engines. And so there's that. The Linglong 2 rockets, however, there is very little information that's available on this, because I expect that this liquid fueled rockets, they're just a PPT so far, or they're still on the drawing board. There's not much information on that. So I'm not sure what to make of these evolutions on Onespace. On one hand, it looks good. You have Onespace, you have a company, a launch company that has a very ambitious launch roadmap, making solid and liquid fueled rockets. It's raised multiple rounds of funding. It successfully launched the OSX suborbital rocket earlier this year. It plans to IPO next year on the Chinese Starboard in 2022. It looks good on paper, but then you have such a crowded, as you mentioned, Blaine, such a crowded Chinese launch landscape, and the fact that Onespace is really, really a latecomer to this. You have land space and iSpace potentially testing their medium lift Methalox and reusable rocket. This year, you have a Galactic Energy doing that next year, and Onespace is just getting started. So what space will be left for those guys in a couple of years when their liquid fueled rocket is ready? And considering the rocky past that Onespace has had in the past, I don't know if I would bet my money on the company. But again, I don't know. What are your thoughts on Onespace, Blaine? Would you put your money on the company?
Gonna make a bad joke here. It's possible that there will be none space for them by the time they get there. Man, that was not good. So what a shocker, though. So Onespace rising from the dead and making an appearance on none other than the official website of the Liangjiang district, or the Liangjiang area, I should say, of Chongqing. So quite a lot to unpack here. So first, big takeaway is, even the most struggling of Chinese commercial space companies can have their renaissance if they can find a motivated enough province or city government to be their patron. And in this case, we have the district, or the new area of Liangjiang in Chongqing. And so to give a little bit of context, so Chongqing is certainly one of China's mega cities. It is a provincial level city, which gives it some special administrative abilities relative to other just cities that are, a sub-provincial level city. And it is the size of Austria in terms of area, which is to say it's not really one single city. It's a bunch of constellation of cities. And there's about 30 million people in Chongqing. And it is also smack dab in the middle of China's relatively less developed western provinces, which has meant that Chongqing has seen a lot of investment over the last 5 or 10 years as the central government has tried to develop this western part of China. And so just to give an example, when the Yangjiang new area was established in 2010, it was only the third sub-provincial level new area in China after Binhai in Tianjin and after Pudong in Shanghai. Probably most of you would have heard of Pudong, although Binhai is quite nice also. That being the case, Yangjiang is a very wealthy patron. They have a lot of, I presume they have a lot of money, a lot of resources, and if one were to be looking for patrons of rocket factories, the Yangjiang new area is not a bad patron to find. Which takes us to Onespace. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting update. They have found their patron in Yangjiang. The move into liquid rockets, I definitely agree, is a very risky one. They are very much a latecomer to this game. And funding and support from Yangjiang aside, Onespace remains probably the 6th or 7th most well-developed commercial launch company in China. And others are moving a lot more rapidly in areas that are a lot more well-defined. So again, going back to JZYJ, they have not really changed their mission since the beginning, which is to say we want to build liquid Methalox rockets. I'm also kind of curious about what happened to Onespace's apparent like satellite manufacturing and other kind of supporting equipment type of businesses that they had put on their website at some point in, I think, like 2019 maybe. The press release does note that Onespace is focusing on electronics and other subsystems level rocket components, but really it kind of seems like they're continuing to pivot from one idea to another without a tremendous amount of follow through. And I mean, that could be unfair. I don't really have a huge amount of insight into the inner goings on of Onespace, but again, from an outsider perspective, I'm not sure that I would be putting my money on Onespace necessarily. A couple of final points. It's interesting that the article noted more than 100 million RMB of contracts signed by Onespace in Q1 2021. So, I mean, I guess if we assume something like, so 100 million RMB, that's what, 15 million US dollars. If we assume a pretty aggressive price of, say, $5,000 per kilogram to orbit, and we say $15 million, what that gets us to 3,000 kilograms sold. 3,000 times 5,000. Yeah, should be. Yeah, 3,000 kilograms of launch capacity sold in Q1. And that's a very, very guessy number, but hey, let's go with it. Another interesting point is that the article did specify the rules by which Onespace hopes to IPO on the Starboard. And so just to give a very little bit of context, the Shanghai Starboard is China's sort of like tech and other kind of venture capitalist kind of stock market based in Shanghai. It is an attempt to encourage earlier stage companies that are perhaps a bit riskier to go public. And so the Shanghai Starboard has several different sets of standards which to list a company, and a company that wants to list must meet at least one set of these standards. And so in the case of Onespace, the article notes they would be trying to list under the conditions of a market cap of not less than 1.5 billion RMB, so about 200 and something million US dollars, operating income in the most recent year of not less than 200 million RMB, and a cumulative R&D investment over the last 3 years of not less than 15% of cumulative operating income over the past 3 years. So for those of you who are trying to model Onespace's finances at home, you have a good few things that they are hoping to meet by 2022. And that was a nice update from them. Last thing I would point out, and this is speculation as well, but we have seen over the last couple of years a number of satellite manufacturing efforts or constellations that are based in Chongqing. So the most noteworthy would be Hongyan, the constellation of CAS that most likely is going to be folded into the Guowang constellation. But you could imagine a certain amount of localization of demand to the extent that if there are satellites that are going to be launched by companies that are manufacturing them in Chongqing, there may be some preference to launch on Onespace. I don't know. And again, there's probably going to be a lot of other options to launch on. There'd have to be some pretty epic subsidies by the Chongqing Liangjiang New Area government to get people to launch on Onespace. But nonetheless, could be something. Jean, anything else from your side on Onespace?
And to link Onespace and JZYJ, I guess Onespace, in order to catch up, since they're a latecomer to liquid fueled rockets, they could also purchase directly off the shelf the liquid engines from JZYJ or aerospace propulsion or any other pure player in the aerospace in the the rocket engine manufacturing sector. So I guess that's a way also that they can play catch up with the other rocket companies.
That's true. And by that logic, either you or I could go and start a rocket company somewhere in China and then start buying the engines from JZYJ, possibly trading them in exchange for, English language marketing help. But that's another story.
That would not go very well.
No, it's another sales pitch for another day. And I do feel like they might be a little bit offended by the extent to which I talk crap about their name, but it's all in good fun, and we give them plenty of exposure, I suppose, with our little group of watchers and listeners. So I guess that being said, this has been a pretty busy week in terms of space industry ongoings, and certainly, I don't know, anything else, John? Are we all good?
I'm all good.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention, and we hope to see you next week. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville, and this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. Have a good rest of your week. See you next time.
Thank you for watching. Bye.